Pit Talk, brought to you by Shannon's.
Cars are our passion. Building, restoring, or modifying. It's about making it our own. It's an obsession. Shannon's know what it's worth. That's why the agreed value includes all your modifications. Get a quote online today.
This is the moment then that we've all been waiting for.
4 in a row, Max.
Here comes Oscar Piastri, Lando Norris.
They are playing hardball out there at the moment.
The pivotal moment of 2024.
Hello and welcome to Pit Talk, brought to you by Shannon's. On today's episode, Lando Norris wins the Monaco Grand Prix to shave his championship deficit to Oscar Piastri to just 3 points. And did the new two-stop pit stop rule work at all in Monte Carlo? My name's Michael Laminato. It's great to have your company and the company of my co-host, who, according to my parish notices, is Matt Clayton.
Parish notices. First time I've ever been mentioned parish notices, seriously at least. This is an ongoing conversation, thanks to our good friends at Sky Sports. But yes, in answer to your question, did it work at Monaco? No, but that would be the world's shortest podcast, so we probably need to elaborate a touch.
At least another 29 minutes to fill, so there is a little bit more to talk about than that. But there is, of course, the result as well of the Monaco Grand Prix. Forget the fact that the race was typically pretty straightforward. Lando Norris won it, and that is significant. His first Monaco Grand Prix victory, his 6th career victory, and a really important one in the sense of this championship. Actually, less about him winning, although that does shrink the championship deficit. But I think, as I've been saying a lot, we're only 8 rounds in. It's probably a bit too early to be counting points if it's less than a Grand Prix worth of points. But qualifying on pole, and at a circuit where it is such a pressure moment to take pole position in Q3, got 3 laps to do it. They're already good. They're already complete. This felt like a very important weekend from that perspective for him.
Well, he hasn't had much momentum for a while, has he? So I think that qualifying encapsulated everything about his weekend, that he had pole, lost it, reclaimed it. Yeah. Fantastic last 2 or 3 corners of that lap when you go back and watch the end of it. And that's been a McLaren strength all year in terms of being able to have enough tyre life for the final sector or the final couple of corners. We saw that in Australia. I mentioned Australia because that was the last time Norris looked like the class of the field. Yeah. Since then, Piastri's had a run of wins. We've had various Max Verstappen interventions as the season has gone along. But this is the first time Lando looked like he was bossing Formula One again. And so much of this race obviously is won on Saturday. But coming into this weekend, I wasn't sure that he was going to put it together in that way on Saturday. Hugely impressive, but in terms of redressing some of the momentum lost in the series and also within his own team, really significant result. And look, we're 1/3 of the way through the longest season in the history of Formula One, as we get told every year. So points tables as such are not particularly relevant. What this does for momentum and continuity, getting him back to where he was at the beginning of the season, I think is almost more important. Yeah,
it's also interesting as well. It was ahead of this weekend. He was saying that the problems he's facing with this car could take him not weeks, but maybe even months to fully understand and return to that kind of qualifying form. Worth noting that after qualifying, he said, look, this is one result, as important as it is. It's one, we've got to see if I can do this at multiple races. It is also one very particular circuit. But as I think Andrea Stella said, the McLaren team principal, there is no stronger validation than Monaco for if you can qualify in Formula One, qualify well. And like you say, those 3 laps is something that almost would have been unimaginable at any week since Australia.
Yes.
Because it's those last tenths of a second that he just hasn't found, and on 3 occasions he found them. I think this could be... It's also very interesting because it feels like a very asymmetrical result, doesn't it? Because it's Norris making a lot of gains and that potentially being significant in the championship, this maybe being a turning point. But I don't feel like we can necessarily read anything negative into Oscar Piastri's weekend here. Yes, it was a bit of a scrappy build-up, messy round, as he said. But while I think it is fair to say Norris's execution you can take away from this, because execution is the same at any track, Monaco feels so particular that I'm not convinced we can say that Piastri's lost anything this weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. I think particular is the correct word here because, look, in isolation, this is a terrific weekend for Lando Norris. Got back some of the momentum he'd lost internally at McLaren since Piastri went on this run. Because it is so particular, it's hard to really extrapolate too much out of it in terms of what this means going forward. I'm not sure. This weekend bears no relevance to any other weekend, let's be perfectly honest. Even some of the other tight street circuits we go to later in the season, like Singapore, for example. Singapore and Monaco, yes, they're both street tracks, but not all street tracks are created equal. This is the outlier of outliers. I'm not sure. Piastri was a little, percentage points off where he has been, and it's been at such a high level now for so many weekends. He used the word messy. It was a little bit messy. he also did finish on the podium for the 7th consecutive Grand
Yeah.
Prix. So this is what constitutes a messy weekend now. So these are the margins we're playing with. So Norris definitely rose to the occasion, but I think we probably need maybe a greater sample size to see whether is he really back like the start of the season, or is this an outlier based on track position, circuit, and just the peculiarities of the Monaco weekend, because there is nothing like this Grand Prix.
Yeah, I like the idea that this could be viewed as a leveler rather than a step forward for Norris, and now he's going to control the next few races. Obviously, we don't know. Maybe that's exactly what will happen, but I think it was easy to lose over the last few rounds the fact that these are two drivers who are extremely closely matched. Very different psychological makeups and therefore some subtle differences in strengths and weaknesses, but this should be a very tight battle between them. We're now a third of the way of the season and it's 3 points, and it feels like that's about right.
But this is what I like about the way these two guys go about it. And for anyone playing the drinking game at home with the podcast, styles make fights. It's one of my favourite expressions. I love the fact these two guys have both got 6 Grand Prix wins now. But you look at the way they go about it emotionally, the body language their cars have, the way they deal with the press and the stress and the pressure and everything that goes into making a Grand Prix weekend. They come at it from such different angles a lot of the time, racing the same car for the same team and ending up 3 points between them in the championship. It's almost a dead heat after 8 rounds. It's going to be the most interesting part of the rest of the season for me if they do have this baked-in car advantage. It's not going to be two guys doing the same thing going head-to-head to see who's better. I think they're both going to have their strengths and weaknesses depending on the circuit and the circumstances of the weekend. And, the styles that each of these guys employs is going to make this more interesting as we head through the rest of the season. Yeah,
it doesn't feel like just because, although this will be something we'll come to later and in future weeks, just because McLaren feels like it's got the upper hand, I think it could still be a really great championship battle. I want to talk about Ferrari now. Charles Leclerc, second, best result of the year for him, for the team. He was in this great mixed emotional mood afterwards, I think. After qualifying second and after finishing second, recognise on the one hand that this is much better than Ferrari had been expecting that they've achieved so far this year, but to finish second at Monaco is very difficult, especially when he had that great breakthrough victory at this home race last season. He is, I think, almost more than any driver at any track lifts higher. I can't think of another driver who lifts higher for any track than he does at Monaco. Because he was special to watch this weekend, would have been a deserving winner had he somehow manufactured that result. But what do we take away from Ferrari for this weekend? Because it was a high watermark. Even Lewis Hamilton finished so distantly in 5th, was still pretty competitive over the course of the weekend. It was the qualifying penalty that really affected his race. Is this a good result for Ferrari, a good takeaway for Ferrari?
Look, from how erratic that it's been, I don't think you can look at this anything other than a great result for the circumstances. We mentioned the word outlier. Leclerc is fantastic at this racetrack, and there's an energy to the way he does everything here. And it's so interesting to see that home race pressure and what that does to drivers. We see it every year at Albert Park when we had Mark Webber or Daniel Ricciardo, Oscar Piastri. There is something about a home race. And you remember going back F1 in a bygone era, Jenson Button was always awesome in Australia and terrible in Silverstone, and Mark Webber was the opposite. They wish they could trade a lot of the time. But I love Leclerc at this circuit because he does stand taller and he does feel a sense of expectation with what he wants to do. What can we take away from this with Ferrari? Look, I have trust issues. Perhaps it's me. It's not you, it's me. I have trust issues because every time we think we've got them figured out and there's a trajectory there, positive or negative, they'll turn up at the next Grand Prix and it'll be completely tipped upside down. You look at where we're going in a week's time. Is there a more different circuit than the Circuit de Barcelona-Catalunya for a Formula One car than Monaco? I always think that the Spanish Grand Prix, if there's an inherent weakness in your car, that track exposes it brutally because of the nature of that layout, and there's just nowhere to hide there. It's never a particularly great Grand Prix for a spectacle, but it's not a place that tells any lies. And if you've got some issues with your car, this place will expose them. And so, in answer to your question, I'm going to sit on the fence for 7 whole days here, because if we're still having a semi-positive conversation after Catalunya, then look, maybe the light for Ferrari is not the oncoming train. It actually is some light at the end of the tunnel. But Leclerc at this racetrack is special, and you have to think that when Lando Norris locked up into turn 1 there, his eyes would have got very, very big. It's like, this might be my chance to be a back-to-back winner. But considering how bad his luck usually is there, I think second place in the circumstances is pretty good.
Well, remarkably, just his second podium in Monaco after victory last year,
Well,
despite him being three-time pole getter.
Well, he barely finishes a race there before last year because it would always be pole and then it'd be some sort of disaster where he didn't even start one year, as you may remember. Like, everything that could go wrong did. So at least he banished that last year, and that was a hugely emotional part of the 2024 season. But as good a weekend as could be imagined, but also not a surprise because it's Charles Leclerc and it's Monaco.
Yeah, exactly. At least the curse was broken by the victory, and at least he can aim for more than just finishing in the points or finishing at all. Before we move on, I do want to talk briefly about Red Bull Racing because two teams came to this track feeling pretty pessimistic. One was Ferrari, and they ended up having a reasonable weekend. The other was Red Bull Racing. I think Max Verstappen got exactly what he thought he was going to get out of this, which was not a podium, trying a bold strategy that didn't work. I think the evidence of this weekend for Red Bull Racing, or the takeaway, is that this car has all the same problems as last year's car. Maybe it's slightly more benign in some circumstances, but its weakness in slow corners still exists, cannot be ameliorated in the same way clearly Ferrari managed to do so at this track. And again, I think we should be cautious about taking it too much away from this weekend because it is such an outlier. But this felt very validating for everything we thought we understood about this car. It will be an interesting piece to fit into the puzzle of whether or not this championship campaign is real, because it does feel like that question we thought we were getting an answer to in Imola was put on ice this weekend, and it's hard to know what to interpret from it.
Well, I feel like I understand Ferrari less race by race, but I feel like I'm beginning to understand Red Bull more. This car does not like being monstered over curbs. We've seen that for the last couple of years, and you could see that in the way that Max Verstappen was trying to drive it compared to the way Yuki Tsunoda was trying to drive it, and that's a separate conversation. Max has shrugged his shoulders and said, well, this car doesn't like this, I'll just drive around that, which is what you can do when you're a 4-time world champion and pound for pound the best guy in the sport at the moment. This was just a par weekend for them. To see a 4-time world champion for a team of that pedigree basically goal hanging for a safety car or a red flag was a little bit unbecoming, quite frankly. But by the same token, what other cards did they have to play? They weren't in the race with Ferrari, they weren't in the race with McLaren. They had Mercedes had a weird sort of weekend, pointless weekend, so they had them covered. He did the only thing he could do in that I'm going to leave this second stop as late as humanly possible. Something might happen, and if it doesn't, I'm just going to finish where I was probably going to finish anyway. So it was nothing ventured, nothing gained. But I feel we've got a pretty good hold on what Red Bull is. Max will make that car go places it probably shouldn't. Is it as bad as Tsunoda's making it look? No. The sweet spot's somewhere in the middle, probably closer to where Max is. He's still going to have tracks where his sheer ability and the strengths of that car and track position is going to get him. He's going to be a disruptor the way the rest of this season goes. But I still think it's a two-driver fight for the championship, with Max being probably annoying to both of them at some point through the back end of the year, where he just has awesome weekends that you can't explain.
Well, like you said, I think Barcelona will be the litmus test for so much of what we think we know about this campaign. So that'll be this weekend. Before we move on from Monaco, though, we've got to talk about what was the talking point leading into this weekend. This rule change to mandate 2 stops in Monte Carlo. This was brought in. It was relatively recently it was brought in, but it was in response to last year's shocker of a race, where, of course, that early red flag meant there were effectively no pit stops, at least among the leaders or the top 10. 2 stops mandatory at least fixes that, because even if that were to happen again, there'd be 1 more stop. It's probably worth considering at the end of this that the top 4 finished in grid order. Effectively, the top 10 did when you take out Fernando Alonso's retirement and Lewis Hamilton recovering from the penalty he got after qualifying. Everyone finished pretty much where they started. So in one sense, you could say 2 stops at the same track makes no difference because you're still at Monaco. We did, though, get this interesting battle in the lower reaches of the points. I say battle, it's probably not exactly the right word.
It's not a race.
It's not a race. It really wasn't a race. The Racing Bulls started it with Liam Lawson backing up the pack for Isaac Hadjar to make his 2 pit stops for free, essentially. Williams saw that and said, we'll have a bit of that. They did exactly the same, but twice as significant, because then they swapped their cars and got Alex Albon to do exactly what Carlos Sainz had done for him. Mercedes then presumably would have found a way to double that, but George Russell's brain just broke, overtook Alex Albon, I think it was at the time, off the track, and then copped a drive-through penalty and thinks that was better for him anyway. I'm not certain what to conclude from this. I've been thinking about it all day. In some respects, all of this stuff is pretty par for the course in Monaco, but it felt much more exaggerated, much worse, or was it much better? I don't know.
It wasn't necessarily much worse. It's just with the 2 pit stops, we had twice the opportunities to lament how bad it was. That's literally the way I'm seeing it. Normally, it's like, well, there's only one stop and everyone's driving around in formation, but at least we've got the stops done. It's like, we have to do this again.
Yeah.
And so you had 2 separate things going on. I think the top 4 were having a race, much as they are constrained by having a race in Monaco. And I'm not sure what everyone else in the pack was doing, because you mentioned the Alonso retirement, unluckiest guy in Formula One, just asked Fernando.
I think I actually believe that.
Yeah, I do too. He should have scored points. He was fantastic this weekend. And Lewis Hamilton sort of settling into where he probably should have been post-penalty. But watching what Racing Bulls were doing, in that Liam Lawson literally, he may as well have had a caravan on the back of that thing, you know, not getting on the hard shoulder. And Hadjar does 2 pit stops and basically stays exactly where he is. And then the domino effect that caused. And Williams doing it worse, but pointing at Racing Bulls said, well, you did it first. It all became a bit schoolyard to me, didn't it? But I don't know how you solve this, because it's Monaco and it's Formula One. It's an outlier, and it's great that it exists, but it's also great there's only one of them. But as a spectacle, normally you have a slow car race at Monaco. I'm not sure anyone past about position 5 last night was actually having a car race. It was a procession, and the rules were being gamified to a point that it actually kind of jumped the shark a little bit. It got a little bit silly. And George Russell just basically saying, I'm going to deliberately overtake somebody and cop a penalty, and surely that will even be better than what I'm doing. Because breaking his brain is completely right. I can't do this anymore. I'm not getting any points anyway, so I may as well have some fun and try and do something, and then got copped a very severe penalty for doing it. But look, it's the nature of this place. The cars now, it's funny, because Monaco's got this incredible history, you see old vision of old Formula One cars around Monaco when they were lighter and more nimble and didn't just take up so much real estate on the circuit. These cars now look insanely big in some of these really, really narrow parts of the track. And we mentioned this last week. The last 5 minutes of Q3 is awesome TV because everything's on the line. You almost don't know where to look. I'd actually almost one-shot qualifying for Monaco. I actually wouldn't mind that. Everyone gets to go out and does their lap independently without anybody else. That would be awesome TV, because I think you miss a lot of the stuff in qualifying in Monaco. So much going on. The race, you'd be happy to miss it, quite frankly, because once you get past the first quarter and any potential jeopardy, not a hell of a lot happens. But Racing Bulls saw the double pit stop strategy as a way to really gamify this race. And look, full credit to them. They qualified well and they scored a lot of points doing it. Was it a great spectacle? I would suggest not.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting. To go back to George Russell, I thought it was very interesting that the reason he overtook off the track, yes, part of this brain-breaking moment, but he said, I just want to enjoy being at Monaco, because he'd spent the whole time in traffic and he'd lost qualifying. I think that was also the critical part, because he had a technical failure at the very beginning of Q2, so they didn't even have a real chance to really open the taps and have a crack here. So I'm just going to overtake him off the track. I know I'm going to get a penalty. In fact, teams were warned that if this exact scenario happened, it would be more than just the 10 seconds. There would be the potential for a drive-through. So he even knew that. He said, I'm doing it anyway. He said, the last 25 laps had great fun. It doesn't matter. I wasn't going to score points anyway. I could have been to score. It doesn't matter. But I think that's important, because even an ordinary... Now, last year's race was unusually bad. So let's just say a normal bad race, like the kind we had at the very front of this race, where it was sort of like a bit of tension, but nothing too serious. The drivers still come out of the car and have enjoyed themselves, because they were at Monaco. They knew what they were getting themselves into when they qualified. They knew that was where they were going to finish. But they still enjoyed what the Monaco race was, which is unique and should be unique. If drivers then get out of the car and have had a really bad time on Sunday, then the spectacle completely falls down, because you can just about stomach the race being bad if at least the drivers can express afterwards the challenge of staying out of the wall and of being relatively fast around the track. If not, then it doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, the two Williams guys in the pen after the race were so honest. I'm not sure that the organisers and the governing body would have loved it all that much. But Alex Albon basically apologised. Like, I'm really sorry that you had to sit through this because of the way we did it, but we had no choice. And Carlos Sainz was similarly forthright with his comments. They're two good guys to get a soundbite out of in a situation like that. They're two grown-ups in the room. But even as they're doing it, they're like, I can't quite believe we're going through with this. I also can't quite believe that everyone's watching it. But I don't know about you, we have this conversation every year with Monaco. How can we fix Monaco? How can we fix Monaco? You can't fix Monaco. The only way you have different Monacos if you don't have Monaco at all.
Yeah.
So you have to go into this weekend with the lowest possible expectations that it's going to be anything other than a slight variation on what it's been. And we watch the cars go around, and qualifying's great, and it looks great on TV, and there's some shots of the boats, and then we all go to the next round.
Yes.
And you just have to see it as one round in 24. You can't fix everything. It is what it is. It's there for a reason. We move on.
I think the solution, if anyone from F1 is watching, is genuine, by the way. You do the format exactly as it is now, but then Sunday morning, after you have qualifying Saturday night, you have your one-shot qualifying for just the top 10. It's a little bit Bathurst style, except obviously Bathurst gets its own day. But the reason I say move that to Sunday is that at least at the end of Sunday, the talking point is where did they qualify? Because that's where they finished, inevitably. And you get your one-shot qualifying, which is spectacular at Monaco. It makes Sunday more meaningful than just asking Christian Horner why the track should be extended, which inevitably happens and will never happen. So I think do one-shot qualifying, make it Sunday, get more qualifying, which is what's good about Monaco, more bang for your buck, and Sunday then becomes meaningful because the race is, you can put it in brackets afterwards.
Yeah, and you could say, well, why we're making an exception for this one Grand Prix. Monaco is an exception by virtue of the fact that it even exists. It's a 260-kilometre car race. It's not like any of the other races on the calendar. We're already making so many concessions to keep this thing on the calendar. So, sure, let's have our top 10 one-lap qualifying.
I think that's the one for it.
Let's run the track in reverse one year. Let's go completely. Let's go completely crazy. Let's do something different because it is a different Grand Prix.
Yeah, and I think that's all that needs to be done. We don't need these extra stops. You can keep if you want. Maybe next year will be
all
better.
fixed.
Remarkably, Matt, it's time for Move of the Week, brought to you by Shannon's. Now, we're going to transition soon to some other sports, so I'm going to kick us off. And this is less of a Move of the Week and more of an appreciation of the week, because I watched back the Monaco Grand Prix, sadly.
You did?
Gabriel Bortoleto made an overtake on Andrea Kimi Antonelli. One overtake.
He did.
And Nico Hülkenberg overtook Yuki Tsunoda, both on the first lap. They're the only two overtakes I could find. So they're going to share for me the Move of the Week because they made overtakes in Monaco. Yes, Gabriel Bortoleto immediately ended up in the fence after his. But you know what? He tried.
First time Sauber's been mentioned on this podcast, possibly ever. Greatest overtaking car in Formula One.
Yes, there you go. They were the only teams that moved forward on the first lap.
They had a crack.
They had a good crack. And as a result, they are my moves of the week.
Moves plural.
Yes.
Well, speaking of having a crack, I'm going two wheels here.
Yep.
You and I were messaging as this was going on. The Moto2 race at the British Grand Prix at Silverstone. Senna AGS pulled the Stephen Bradbury on the final lap of the Moto2 race, made the most of some silliness going on between Aaron Canet and David Alonso up ahead of him, played the last two corners of the final lap of the race absolutely spectacularly, and ends up becoming Australia's first intermediate class winner since Remy Gardner 5 years ago. First Grand Prix win for him, and certainly won't be the last. He's 19, AGS, and there's just something about him, the way he carries himself, how rapid the learning curve has been. We remember him on the podium at Phillip Island last year, completely on merit. This was that opportunistically brilliant win, taken from a position of composure. These are the wins that these guys have that are going to make it coming through. Fantastically opportunistic. Great to see an Australian on the top step of a MotoGP podium. Haven't seen one for a while, but move of the week. I don't know if it gets any better when you go from third to first with two corners to go and win your first Grand Prix.
I love that as well, because some people think, when there's two riders or drivers battling, it's just easy. Wait for them to make a mistake. But you could really tell, and this was a great example of it, you really got to think ahead to make a move like that work. You've got to predict what's going to happen, and he nailed it.
Well, and also knowing the personnel in that situation, like Aaron Canet is not going down wondering in that sort of situation. He's not going to be bullied by an 18-year-old kid that's come up from Moto3. So you knew that Canet was going to very robustly defend that last quarter, and Aegis knew the personnel that was ahead of him and played it perfectly, and he's a Grand Prix winner. Yes,
congratulations to him. Now, on a related note, let's move to interested versus expert. A lot of me being interested this week and you being the expert, because there was no Supercars this weekend. We've still got a couple of weeks before the round over in Perth, but there was the British Grand Prix, the British Motorcycle Grand Prix. It was typically a British Motorcycle Grand Prix as well, because yet again, not a repeat winner, but a lot of action. Like, it was non-stop, a lot to think about, a lot to talk about. What were your takeaways here?
This is one of the most bizarre streaks in world sport at this point. So Marco Bezzecchi wins that race for Aprilia on Sunday night, Australian time. That is the 11th different rider to win the past 11 British Motorcycle Grand Prix. It makes absolutely no sense. And coming into the weekend, you would have thought, well, surely this is the year that this gets overturned, because Aprilia hasn't really been anywhere this year. Bezzecchi joined them at the start of this season, hasn't been great. Aprilia has been in the news for other headlines, with Jorge Martin trying to get out of Aprilia, having not even completed a single race distance for them yet.
I wonder what he was thinking.
Well, and so there's all this going on in the background, and then he's 10th on the grid. Yeah. It was a bizarre race win, but completely in character for MotoGP at this particular circuit. And it's funny, Silverstone, in that it's a great layout for bikes with the high-speed sweeping corners. It's a bit of a long lap. It's the longest lap in MotoGP. And I think whenever you get MotoGP laps that are starting to fall into the 2-minute range, it's a little bit too long. And you see it at the tracks where Circuit of the Americas, where F1 goes, Silverstone, obviously, British Grand Prix for F1. But as a spectacle, this was the earliest this race has been held ever since it's been at Silverstone. It was in May. Normally it's in August, September. It was cold. So you're talking 15-degree ambience, barely 25-degree track temps. It completely changed the way this race was won. And it was all about being on the correct tyre, probably the atypical tyre at the right time. You needed to be on a soft front tyre here because it was too cold for anything harder than that. But then you also had to live with the fact that that soft front tyre is probably going to go off towards the end of the race. So you had this real cat and mouse strategic race going on. Fantastic win for Bezzecchi, but Fabio Quartararo and Yamaha, the hardest of hard luck stories. If anyone ever doubted this guy is an absolute top liner in MotoGP, 3 straight pole positions as Yamaha's starting to ascend again. That race was done. He had a 4.5-second lead, 12 laps into a 19-lap race, and was doing it with a leg in the air. And of all the things to happen, rear ride height device gets stuck, can't disengage it. And he has not won a race since midpoint of 2022. And there's been a lot of reasons for that haven't been him. And so to see him right on the cusp of breaking that drought and then having that taken away from him, look, he was absolutely devastated, as you could imagine. But I think if anyone wondered where this guy sits in the top line of MotoGP riders on the current grid, he is right up there. That Yamaha project is really coming along at the moment. He will be in winning positions again, but for a weekend that he dominated that race on Sunday, deserved far better. But it was just another subplot in... I think MotoGP only does crazy races at the moment. It seems that, we were talking about France last week with Joe and Zarco winning. Every second race seems to be completely nuts at the moment. It's great TV, but a bit of variety at the front end of the championship, and I'm here for it.
Yes, well, it was a very exciting point just before he crashed, I suppose, where there were no Ducatis on the podium.
Well, and because we had a restarted race, I think that was part of what I was saying before about being on the correct tyre there, because we had a race that was abandoned on the second lap after we had both Marquez brothers down in the first 2 laps, and then a bike on fire and oil all over the track in the last couple of corners that prompted the red flag, so the Marquez brothers effectively got a do-over. Little known rule in MotoGP, if there is a red flag within the first 3 laps, all riders can take the restart. And so that's something a lot of people were saying, why are these guys back in the race? Like anyone that had crashed out in those first 2 laps, and there were a few of them, they effectively got a hard reset. So, Marc Marquez actually extended his championship lead through all of the silliness on Sunday at Silverstone. Admitted afterwards he got very, very lucky. Finished 3rd. Not a particularly good weekend for him. But these are the weekends where you just stack points relative to your rivals and they all count towards the end of the year. But suitably bonkers at Silverstone and very enjoyable.
Yes, as MotoGP, as you say, this year reliably has been, which is very exciting. Let me very briefly engage your interest before we wrap this one up, because there was no Supercars of the weekend, but there was news that there will be 2 races in New Zealand next year. So the international expansion. We consider New Zealand international, of course it is, a different country. Continues, and it sounds like it will be back-to-back. It will be a double-header. They will be obviously right alongside each other, because why would you go all the way there to come back and go back and go back again?
Yes.
But it sounds like it's being billed by CEO Shane Howard as a fortnight, 2 weeks of Supercars mayhem on the North Island and the South Island. So we're looking at probably consecutive weekends, which would be very exciting. Doesn't normally happen in Supercars. I'll be interested to see, well, first of all, the response. I mean, this is now a nationwide thing for New Zealand. Both islands are covered. But also the response in how that back-to-back is handled. Because like I say, Supercars doesn't do it that often.
No.
What's that going to mean for momentum? If we're going to have the same race formats next year, that's 6 races it'll be about 8 days, I suppose. It's a lot of racing in a few days. How will you bounce back? What if there's a big crash? You're very far away from home in New Zealand, especially if the cars are all being taken by boat again. Like, logistically is very interesting. It's great for New Zealand, and I think it's great for Supercars, because while there's been a lot of talk in the last few years, let's say, about really sending it overseas to Asia, whatever. I think if you're going to expand anywhere first, it's got to be New Zealand. The fan base is pretty big there. We've got plenty of Kiwi drivers.
Yep.
Matt Payne foremost among them at the moment. Great legacy, obviously, New Zealand as well. Great history in New Zealand. They needed more than one. They deserved more than one race. And it's really great that this has now come about. And it's going to be, I think, a really interesting little experiment to be racing that much overseas all in one block, all in such a short period of time.
I like it from the perspective of the Aussie fans, in that if you were thinking of potentially going over to see an international race, and that was one of those things, look, it's only just at weekend, can I justify the cost? You can go over there and lock into this festival that's going to be over there for the couple of weeks, absolutely justify the spend. It'll be really interesting to see what the Australian fan contingent that goes over to see this, because that's now a significant carrot. See two different parts of the country, two different racetracks within a 10-day period. It's a lot of racing to enjoy. I could see it being quite a tourist boom, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Taupo obviously already touristy, and then Christchurch continues the rebuild, I guess, after the earthquakes. I was there only last year, I think. Beautiful part of the world. I mean, New Zealand is a beautiful part of the world. But Christchurch in that South Island area, particularly so. Track's right near Christchurch as well. I think it's only 15 kilometres away, something like that. Very close. It would be a great trip. Now you got me thinking, maybe you think about going to New Zealand? Maybe you should go.
Pit Talk on the road.
Oh, look, if Shannons want to support it, I'm all for it. Let's wrap this one up, Matt, with the crystal ball by Complete Home Filtration. We're in the middle of an F1 triple header. MotoGP races are flowing now. Supercars not far away. What are you thinking?
Oh, I'm going to get a little bit naughty here.
Oh, go on.
My crystal ball tells me that Isaac Hadjar is going to be mentioned as a Red Bull racing driver.
Oh, of course he is.
Very, very, very soon.
Yes.
And all jokes aside, because he's performing where Liam Lawson didn't and Yuki Tsunoda isn't.
Yes.
Isaac Hadjar has massively surprised me this year, in that I thought of all the rookies this year, he was the one that was probably going to have the most crash damage and was going to be the most erratic. He's ticked every box for me. He's been very, very good, surprisingly calm, taken every opportunity. And yes, we talked about the Monaco confluence of circumstances, but he was there to be the beneficiary of that strategy. And look, who on earth knows what's going on with Red Bull's second driver? Do they know they've got a second driver? Do they even care they've got a second driver? But right now, of the three other Red Bull back drivers on the grid, he seems to me to be the most qualified to be Max Verstappen's teammate, which is also a poison chalice, so you've got to be careful what you wish for. But I think very soon we're going to see some serious conversations about Hadjar potentially being in that car, because quite frankly, the two guys that have been in it this year are not delivering.
I mean, this is such a big talking point that I feel like we can't complete it right now.
No, it's a whole podcast.
But all I would say is that we were saying the same thing about Yuki Tsunoda about a month ago when he was at Racing Bulls.
No,
so I think the problems are really big at Red Bull Racing. I'm going to stick with Red Bull Racing for my prediction. Something we haven't talked about this week, but we will debrief next week, is that there are some rule changes coming, or rule reinterpretations coming this weekend to the flexibility of front wings. All very exciting and technical. But Red Bull Racing's been telling us, or hinting, non-stop for a month, that this is the thing. This is what's going to break this championship open. They're going to be back after this rule change. It brings McLaren back more than it brings back any other team. I'm going to say McLaren's going to win by 60 seconds. Not 60 seconds. They're going to win comfortably, and then Red Bull Racing's going to have to come up with some new reasons as to why the car's not quite there.
Well, we mentioned before that Catalonia is this great litmus test of what a Formula One car can do. We often get really dominant wins there. You think back in the Mercedes domination, they would absolutely demolish everybody there. Whichever team has got the car in the sweet spot, it tends to be magnified at this particular track. So if McLaren, even with this new technical directive, come out and demolish everyone this weekend, then Christian Horner's press debrief will be mandatory viewing, I think. Yeah,
I think so. I'm looking forward to it. That's all the time we have for Pit Talk today. You can subscribe to Pit Talk wherever you get your favourite podcasts, and you can leave us a rating and a review as well. This weekend it is the Spanish Formula One Grand Prix. Lights are out at 11 p.m. on Sunday night, and you can keep up to date with all the latest F1, MotoGP and Supercars news at foxsports.com.au. Until next week, for Matt Clayton, I'm Michael Laminato. We'll catch you then.